Hello and welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're now in class 51 and we're going to talk about the events in the Garden of Gethsemane and the arrest of Jesus. But before we go to the text and that, I'd like to show you what is the probable route of Jesus on the last night of his life, because it helps us understand all that he went through and really how difficult it was just getting to the cross, much less the cross itself. We begin in what was the southwestern part of the city of Jerusalem in that time at the Last Supper in the upper room. And then it's likely that Jesus went down what are called now the Holy Stairs, which are still there from the first century, through the upper and lower city of Jerusalem, and then into the temple courts where they may have prayed for a while with the other Jews, may have seen the vine with the grapes that we mentioned in the last class, then on out through the eastern gate, across the Kidron Valley, and then into the Garden of Gethsemane. Then when the soldiers arrested Jesus, they probably didn't take him back through the temple, but rather took him around the southern part of the city to avoid people knowing about it, and then back almost to where they started, to the house of Caiaphas up here in the southwestern part of the city again. Then when Caiaphas couldn't sentence him to death, the Romans had to do that, then he sent him over to the fortress Antonia, and so he probably went back out around the city, through the Kidron Valley, and then into the Antonia fortress here, where Pilate likely was. When Pilate found out he was from Galilee, then Pilate sent him over to Herod's palace at Herod, here on the western part of the city. And then when Herod couldn't get a word out of him, he sent him back to Pilate, where he was scourged and then sentenced to death. So he came outside the wall here and was crucified on Calvary. Now, if we look at it on the actual model of Jerusalem, in the time of Jesus, we've kind of flipped our perspective. Now we're standing on the Mount of Olives, looking toward the southwestern part of the city, either here or maybe a little bit further left where they started in the Last Supper. And then they would have come down through this part of the city, up the stairs into the temple courts where they would have worshiped some, out through the eastern gate, through the Kidron Valley, and over to the Garden of Gethsemane on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives here. And then arrested and taken back around the southern part here, back to Caiaphas's house, which again is probably right around here or a little bit further left. And then from there, back around the city, over to the northern part of the temple courts where the Antonia fortress is, then over to Herod's palace on the western wall, back to the Antonia fortress with Pilate where he was scourged, and then sent out to Calvary to be crucified. So it's really amazing just to see how much Jesus suffered just on the way to the cross, much less the cross itself. This is a lot of walking up and down, and you'll see more of that later on with some of the pictures. Now, we want to show you visually some of these places before we get to the text in Matthew 26. This is a mural, one of two, on the wall outside of what is now St. Peter's Church of Gallicantu. We'll show you more of that later. And this mural represents Jesus coming with his disciples down the holy stairs on his way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And these are the stairs that they call the Holy Stairs. They know these are from the first century. And these stairs, along with several other things in this very area from the first century, are what helped convince the archaeologists that this is likely the spot for Caiaphas's house from the first century. So Jesus and his disciples would have gone down the stairs and over this direction toward the temple. So you can already see the distances and the up and down nature. And then after they come through the temple courts and out the eastern gates, now they're standing just outside what would have been the temple wall, looking across the Kidron Valley down here over to the Garden of Gethsemane, all along here on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. This church, the Church of All Nations, was built by about 12 different nations. That's one reason for the name. And also Jesus died for all nations. And it's one of the most holy places considered by many because inside the altar is kind of built near and around a big rock where they think Jesus may have prayed that night in Gethsemane. They don't know the exact spot, but that is one of the possible locations. To the left of the church right here is a more public garden with several old olive trees, and then across a little road here there's a private part of the Garden of Gethsemane where you can go to meditate and have devotionals. So really meaningful there. So I want to switch now over to one of our 360 videos about the Garden of Gethsemane. So let me switch real quickly here. Okay, so now we're looking at my friend Brent there, and here is the Church of All Nations, and going there. Then just to its left, as we're looking at it, here is part of the Garden of Gethsemane, fenced in now because there's some of these trees are pretty old, and so again you see it's not that large. And then you look on back across, you see the valley, the Kidron Valley there. You see the eastern gate here that we mentioned before, where Jesus would have come out that night, and then of course back to the garden here. Okay, so again we'll jump back across. Okay, then if we look into the Garden of Gethsemane, this is the private area that I mentioned to you of the garden. And then this is one of the olive trees that's pretty amazing. If you look how big this thing is, probably it would take at least 3 or 4 people to come here and put their arms around this tree. And even then, maybe 3 or 4 people couldn't reach if they tried to reach around this whole tree. An interesting fact about this is that the botanists have come to the Mount of Olives and studied the trees that are on it, wanting to know if there are any trees that may have been left from that night from the time of Jesus. Although through the wars in the last 2,000 years, most of the olive trees were cut down and used in some fashion during the wars. They think there are 7 or 8 trees that were still there from the time of Jesus, and this is one of those trees that might be there from the time. So it's interesting to think about the fact that this tree might have been there that night when Jesus was praying in the garden. So let's go to the text and read the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26, verses 36 through 46. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it's not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Now, several things about the garden scene that we'd like to point out. One is the very name, Gethsemane in Hebrew, means olive press. And so this is the garden of the olive press, and they know it was used for that purpose. And if you look at this picture here, you have a view of that huge stone. Let me jump back here. The huge stone that they would use to put up on its side. They would put all the olives in this basin here, and then they would crush the olives with this huge, heavy stone. This is one of those they found all over Israel. And so the idea is that Jesus comes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and on this night, with the punishment and the cross so close, the time he's going to take on the weight of all the sins of the world on his shoulders, it's as if he himself is being crushed, and the life is being crushed out of him, and that life is going to be precious, just like the extra virgin olive oil that comes out first, the most sacred, used in the temple. This blood of Jesus, the life of Jesus that's crushed out of him on the cross, is going to be precious and used for our salvation. So again, a pretty stark image there of what Jesus was facing in the garden and why he was praying and sweating drops of blood there. We also see in this story a contrast to the Garden of Eden, two different gardens from two different parts of time. In the first garden, where the first Adam and Eve didn't submit to the will of God, and they were defeated. They fell to the temptation, and death entered the world through them. And here in the Garden of Gethsemane, the second Adam defeats temptation, submits to God, and then redeems humanity from the first sin and everything that's come afterwards. And you notice that Jesus, in the middle of the garden, while he's praying, he wants all this to be taken away if it's possible. This is one of the most human moments of Jesus' life. He knows this is what he's come for. He knows that it's not going to be taken away. He's already prophesied to his disciples this is what's going to happen to him. And yet, in the moment, he's very human and says, if it's possible, I don't want to suffer this at all. And yet, not my will be done, but yours. We see this little sculpture outside the Church of All Nations, this moment where he's just throwing himself on the mercies of God and realizing that he is going to have to suffer no matter what. One other detail that I wanted to mention, near the Garden of Gethsemane, just on the slope there of the Mount of Olives, there's a cave, and it's a pretty good sized cave actually. If you go inside of it, it's used now for a devotional spot. This is also from the time of Jesus, and it's likely that Jesus and his disciples stayed here during the festivals when they would come to Jerusalem. Since they didn't have houses, then they would come out and stay on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, maybe in this cave, or maybe they would go to Bethany in the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But the interesting thing is, in the text, one of the versions of the gospel says he took Peter, James, and John and took them away and then went about a stone's throw away. And if you're standing in the Garden of Gethsemane and looking over to this cave, it's about a stone's throw away. So an interesting detail confirmed there in the Gospels. And then this term, this Father, if it's possible, let this cup be taken from me. Abba is the word there in Aramaic and Hebrew. It's a trusting and a loving Father. And so he's in an intimate moment with his Father and begging for the cup to be taken away. But again, he chooses to do what God wants to do. And if you look at the different points in Jesus' ministry, he had many times when he could have chosen to please himself or take the easier path to not do what the mission was, and yet he always decides to obey. Not once did he shirk what he was supposed to do. Not once did he take the easier path if it meant that he was going to disobey God. And so if you look at some of the different passages, Matthew 16, verse 21, he's there at Caesarea Philippi, and he's telling the disciples, this is what's going to happen to me. And Peter says, no, never, Lord. That's one point where he was far away from Jerusalem and could have stayed in Galilee, but he chose not to. And then in chapter 20, verse 17, again, he says, this is what's going to happen to me. Now he's a lot closer to Jerusalem. He still hasn't entered in Jerusalem yet. He could have not entered, and yet he decides to obey. And then in John 12, verses 23 through 28, he says, and now the time has come, and what shall I say? Shall I say, Father, save me from this hour? He says, no, it is for there is this very moment that I came to this hour. So, Father, glorify your name. Again, that choice that's possible. And yet he says, no, I'm not going to do what would be easy. I'm going to obey the Father. And you see it also in chapter 13, verse 21, when he is in the Last Supper and he sends Judas out to betray him. You see in Matthew 26, verses 39 through 42 that we just read about, it's your will, I want to do it. And then if you look a little bit further down in verses 49 through 52, he could have resisted arrest. He could have called on angels to save him, and yet he chooses not to do that. And the version of the arrest in John 18, verses 4 through 11, one verse says, knowing all that was going to happen to him, he went out and he faced the soldiers. In other words, again, that choice that he had, and they ask him, we're coming for Jesus of Nazareth. Who is he? And he says, I'm he, and let these other guys go. And so again, he chooses to stay even while he's letting his disciples go. And then finally, in Matthew 26, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, before Caiaphas, he has a choice about admitting if he is who Caiaphas says he is, if he is the Son of God. And he has a choice not to say anything and perhaps save himself, but he decides to say it, and then he condemns himself to death. He kind of assures that Caiaphas will seek crucifixion for him. And so that example throughout the last part of Jesus' ministry, especially, how he has choice after choice to disobey, and yet he decides every time to obey. It's pretty amazing. So just mention all these passages right here. Okay, now the actual arrest itself, let's go on and continue reading in chapter 26, verse 47. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priest and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kissed is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Jesus replied, Do what you came for, friend. Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way? In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, Am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. Now notice in the different versions of this story that you can look up and compare, one interesting detail in Luke's version, chapter 22, verse 48, he asked Judas, do you betray me with a kiss? In other words, it's supposed to be a sign of affection, a sign of greeting a friend, and yet you're actually using that to identify me and betray me. And you notice in this version he calls him friend, and I don't think he says it sarcastically. I think he says it probably sadly. In John's version again, you notice that Jesus asks the guards twice who they're seeking, and they tell him Jesus of Nazareth, and then he says, now let these go. And if you look back in John 17:12, he says, I've not lost any of the ones that you gave me, except for the one who is going to betray me. And I think Jesus is trying to fulfill that. He doesn't want to lose any of the disciples this night. He himself goes, but he doesn't want his disciples to go to death. And then finally, the detail about Peter cutting off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. Those details come out in the different versions. But only Luke tells about Jesus healing Malchus there in the middle of the garden, healing one of the men that's come to arrest him. Again, returning good for evil in that moment. And then you see that Jesus is taken back up to the house of Caiaphas. And here's the other mural outside there that shows Jesus on the way back up the holy stairs, under arrest now, being beaten and dragged by the soldiers. And at this point, when the arrest actually happens, there's a difference in what the Gospels report about who stayed. Matthew says that all the disciples abandoned him. Mark is the only one that mentions that during the arrest, there's a young man who's there that the soldiers try to grab, but he gets out of his cloak and runs away naked. And most people think that's probably Mark, a young Mark, telling that story kind of on himself. Luke's version of the arrest says that as Jesus was dragged off, that Peter followed at a distance. And then John's version says that Peter and one other followed Jesus all the way to the courts of the house of Caiaphas. And most people think that one other, not mentioned by name, is actually John himself, that he knew some people inside Caiaphas's house, maybe some of the servants that worked there, and that's how Peter got into the courts of Caiaphas. So a sad story, but a story of faithfulness also, where Jesus knows what's going to happen, and he says, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to do the will of God. So we'll leave that there, and next time we'll come back and talk about the trial of Jesus and the house of Caiaphas.